Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining today's live stream about digital transformation. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And today's topic that we're going to cover today is using business processes and technology to improve supply chains. And I'll introduce our guest here today, who is a first-time guest. Really excited to have her on the show here today. But before I introduce our guest, just a couple of logistical things. First of all, this live discussion is part of our live production of a weekly podcast that we do called Transformation Ground Control. We do these live interviews to get your involvement in the podcast, and then we edit it and we add more content to it and create a full episode that gets released a few weeks out. So thank you for being part of our live production here today of that podcast. And if you want to watch that podcast or see past episodes, you can go to transformationgroundcontrol.com is the website for where you can listen or watch to that podcast. Secondly, and lastly, before I introduce our guest, I've got a list of questions, a whole ton of questions I want to ask our guest here today. But what's even more important is that you all ask questions. So any questions you have here in the audience, I'd love to hear from you. What kind of questions you have around the world of supply chain management, what trends you're interested in learning more about, technology, process improvement, all that kind of stuff. That's what we're going to talk about here today. So any questions you have along those lines, would love to get your feedback and your questions there. And speaking of which, we're watching the chat here as we go through this interview. And I'd love to hear from the audience here what city and country you're joining from today. So if you don't mind, just drop in the chat. What city and country are you in? We tend to appeal to a global audience. We tend to get people from all over the world in these live streams. So I'd love to hear where you're joining from today. I myself am in Denver, Colorado here today, and I'll let my guest explain where she is today. And speaking of my guest, Casey Jenkins, who is the CEO and owner of 828 Consulting, is here today. And we're going to talk about using business processes and technology to improve supply chains. Casey, thanks for being here today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I am coming from Savannah, Georgia, and I'm always interested in hearing where everyone is listening from. I think it's always so intriguing to see what type of presence you're getting to reach with these types of platforms. So yeah, excited to see where everyone's tuning in from.
Yeah, definitely. And what's cool about what you're here to talk about is this is such a global topic. I mean, this is something that doesn't matter where in the world you are. Yes. This is something that's going to be very relevant to you. So excited to dive into it. We were talking before we went live here today that it's been a while since we've covered this topic on this podcast and in these live sessions. So I'm really excited to have you here to chat about that. But before I just dive in and start asking you a bunch of questions and the audience starts barraging you with questions, maybe tell us about you and your company, your background, and all that good stuff.
Yes. So yes, like you said, I'm Casey Jenkins. I'm the owner and CEO of 828 Consulting, and I focus on process improvement, specifically within supply chain processes, but it can be any business process. I work with companies up to about 30 mil in rev, anyone who produces a product. So CPG, manufacturing, retail, food and beverage. If you've produced a product, you probably have a process and it probably needs improved. Right. And I also work with some tech companies developing solutions within the supply chain space and kind of guiding them on how to make sure that their solution is appealing to different processes that are within an organization and what features are needed and things like that. I've been in the industry for 10 years, diverse background. I've done everything from brokerage within transportation all the way up to international supply chain management. Took a little left turn into tech and worked with some tech companies. And then now doing my own thing, and it's been quite the journey. I know one of the questions was about my degrees. I've got master's degree in supply chain management, master's degree in project management, black belt in Lean Six Sigma. So I definitely come at the industry with a very educational perspective, but then how to apply it more practically as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So what, that's an interesting story to get to where you are today. I guess before I dive into some other questions about your background, tell us about 828 Consulting and what you guys do, what you specialize in.
Yeah, so process improvement. So like I said, I can work with any business process, but primarily I like to more stay within like the transportation realm, the distribution realm. I feel like there's a lot of improvements within that area of supply chain. I get requests though for, even procurement, manufacturing, just how to make these different sequential steps be streamlined. So I've worked with returns processes. I've worked with even sales cycles, and how to make sure that those are integrated with your operations so companies are prepared to execute on what they're selling. But mainly trying to, just like everyone else is trying to do, increase efficiency, reduce your cost, and add value into your supply chain, and make sure that your customers are getting what they expect and what they want to be getting.
Yeah. It's funny you talk about the returns process because when I was way early in my career at one of the big five consulting firms, my first process improvement project was a returns process reengineering. And I thought returns process how hard can that be? And it turns out
Right.
it can be very complex and
Oh my gosh.
great.
Yeah. Well,
So
and it's often it's a forgotten piece, right?
yeah,
I don't think companies really pay attention to that side very often, and the one company that I had worked with where I streamlined the return process, it's like, oh, we'll take that back, we'll figure it out later, and then it never gets, you know, you'll circle back around on it. And so then it's like, well, what are we doing with all this stuff sitting in our warehouse? And we
yeah.
didn't do this, we didn't do that. So I think it's a forgotten piece of supply chain sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot of little nooks and crannies and forgotten pieces of supply
Yes.
chains as we'll talk about.
Yes.
Before I get to my next question, I want to say hello to Amy from Houston, Texas, Dev from India. Thanks for being here today. As Casey mentioned, she's from Savannah, Georgia. I'm from Denver, Colorado. Love to hear where the rest of the audience is from here today. Usually in these summer months, the audience starts off a little quiet. So I'm trying to get the audience talking here. I think people are in summertime mode for much of the northern hemisphere here. But love to hear where you're from today. But tell us a bit about how did you end up in supply chain and process improvement? Like, how did you plan on doing this all along? Was it sort of some grand master plan you had as a kid, or did you stumble into it? How'd you end up here?
That is a great story, to be honest. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a meteorologist. So
Oh,
I wanted to be the next, Jim Cantori. Like that was my dream. I loved weather. I loved, storm chasing. I am a storm spotter with NOAA. It's now a hobby. But I used to love like watching the radar, forecasting, all of it. And I do actually have 2 degrees in weather. But I got out of undergrad and got into the workforce and got into transportation. And I started to go, well, wait a second, this is kind of cool. I had never up until that point paid attention to, looked at how are products actually moving. And I really enjoyed the transportation side of things and got finished with my weather degree. And I was like, well, what's next? Like, do I just completely forego this experience that I have within, transportation supply chain or and go the route of weather? Or do I maybe get some more education in this field that I already have some experience in? And I chose supply chain. So I like to say that I got into it by accident and I stayed into it by choice. And I feel like that's a lot of people. That's how they've gotten into the industry. You're either chose to do it because family or someone is in it, or you accidentally got into it and you stayed in it. But I really enjoy the challenge. And I think that's one thing that's fun about the industry is that it's always changing and it's always challenging. But then I realized very quickly, because everyone always asks me, well, how are weather and supply chain related at all? They're both processes, right? When you really stop to think about it, they are both processes. So like within weather, you have something that'll happen in the atmosphere that triggers an output, right? Same thing within supply chain, same thing within business. One small change in a weather process can produce a different output. Well, you've got the same thing in supply chain and business as well. So I just quickly realized that both are processes. I just like how things work. I just like an order to things. I like being able to find out how to get to an output easier, faster, more efficiently. And so that's how I got into it and stayed into it. And I would say it suits me. It suits
yeah.
me pretty well.
Well, I couldn't help but think about as you're talking about transportation and weather and meteorology, and you were talking earlier about the tech companies you've worked with and
Mhm.
thinking about AI and it made me start to think, I wonder if there's a way to marry, weather patterns and predictions with transportation, logistics, supply chain, and how it affects it and how you should route things differently potentially. I mean, might be a way for you to work back into meteorology and use some of that data to help in an AI sort of a way potentially.
Yeah, well, there are some companies out there who actually do that, because it's a part of like a risk management strategy, right? I mean, we all know that certain areas of the country end up facing, adverse weather. Let's look at the Southeast during hurricane season, or the Midwest during, storm season, the snow in the Rockies and, the, I guess, more Pacific Northwest. But, it's one of those things where companies do have to shift around because of the weather. So there is actually a little more direct of a tie than just the process side of it, in that, weather does impact, risks and potential risks, whether that's just having to reroute, flooding or risk to the business itself or the assets themselves, things like that. So yeah, there are some companies out there who do that though. It is
That's
a part of
interesting.
risk management for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So you were talking about your education. It's a little intimidating because you're very well educated. I thought I was pretty well educated, but I do not have this academic pedigree that you have. But you've got dual master's degrees in supply chain management, project management, and then a black belt in Lean Six Sigma. I only have one master's degree, and I'm a green belt in Six Sigma. So you've totally outdone me, and maybe a lot of the people listening here today. But tell us how you ended up doing. How'd you pursue this academic side of things?
Yes. Well, another thing I'll add is I did just start my doctorate in business administration as well, focusing
Okay.
on supply chain logistics. So one thing is I truly just love learning. That's a big thing for me. Is I love understanding from a theoretical and conceptual standpoint how things work. But when I started to go into supply chain, I felt like I needed that framework. I needed that understanding. I needed that baseline conceptual, I guess, perspective of how this all works. That's just how I learn. That's just how I am. I need to know the why behind things to make sure that I know how to effectively execute those things. And when I finished up my supply chain masters, it was actually right as COVID was happening. And I started to see how companies were going to be executing a lot of projects within supply chain specifically on how to optimize, how to combat some of the challenges that COVID actually brought, or highlighted some areas of improvement that we all needed as organizations. And so I said, well, hey, I should go get some education and framework around how project management works and then marry the two together.
Hmm.
And I quickly learned, though, that project management and supply chain management are very, very interconnected disciplines. And the mindsets needed for both are very, very similar. Some of the tools that are used can be used cross-disciplinary. Some of the frameworks can be used on both sides, but it's also important as a project manager executing some of these initiatives within supply chain, understanding how that project is feeding into the operational side of the business. I think from a strictly project management perspective, and I can say this knowing both disciplines, it's you're just executing the tasks to get to the output, but understanding how that output feeds into the overall operations of the business, or how different tasks or delays in a project can impact the overall operations of a business. I think that's important from the project management perspective. The lean side of things, I've heard a lot of talks around if lean is actually still a valuable methodology. And especially because most people said, well, JIT failed, right, within COVID. It doesn't give
Yeah.
leniency to be able to adapt or adjust. But for me, I see it from more of the value and waste components, and how, the customer centric perspective that lean takes. And so I wanted to make sure I had that framework as just a tool in the tool belt, to make sure that I'm approaching things, even if it's not from a wholly lean perspective, but at least applying a few things here and there in relation to value and waste. So that's how those three things are interconnected, at least from my perspective. And I found it valuable. But you'll learn quick that a lot of these methodologies and tools, they're all seeking to do the same thing. So
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You just have to pick which ones apply at what
right.
time. Yeah. So in these 10 years plus you've been in the supply chain industry, what are some of the biggest trends or changes you've seen over the last decade?
Oh my gosh. I would say the first one being the business landscape. And it's funny because I don't really feel like that was changing as quickly prior to the pandemic. And I feel like the pandemic really just shifted that landscape overnight. And I say that because I know, like, in my programs, even before and in my work before the pandemic hit, the way things were working was just so different. And case studies that I was doing, or research that I was doing prior to that point, was looking at some of the ways we're doing things now, right? And it was saying, oh, this is 10, 15 years off. We're not expecting the industry to evolve this quickly. So, like, I think the idea was there that the landscape would eventually get to where we're at now. But I think the pandemic really accelerated it. And I would say that comes from, the landscape itself being, I guess, the customer demands, how fast can we get products into customers' hands, what their expectations are in terms of quality, sourcing, sustainability, what's their experience going to be like. And I feel like that's all really shifted. Before, with brick and mortar, you walked into the store. Now, how fast can I get my stuff delivered online? How fast can this be at my doorstep? And I say that as a serial Amazon purchaser. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say is the technology. Obviously, I don't think we could, go through a conversation without mentioning how, technology has just drastically advanced in the last 5 to 7 years. And just how readily accessible data and information are because of that. I think that's a benefit to the industry for sure. I also can see how it could be a hindrance as well. So,
right. Yeah. Interesting. So yeah, a lot of changes in it's interesting thinking about how COVID sort of accelerated some things that are already sort of percolating under the surface or starting. And then COVID
right.
just sort of fast forwarded a lot of that.
Yes.
And then, of course, now with AI and technology just doing this hockey stick rapid
Yes.
pace of change, it's I imagine it's affecting supply chains even more than in the past.
Yes. Yeah, it's and to be honest, like I said, when I remember a case study that I had done and research within my program, and it was talking about leveraging AI and more visibility and technology. And it was like, yeah, we don't expect this for another 10 to 15 years. And it's like, it's only been 6 years. Now we're already way further advanced, I feel like, than what was predicted, 5-6 years ago. So it really is interesting to see how things have shifted. But it's important, I think, for companies to understand that, you can't go from 0 to 100 overnight either. There has to be some sort of incremental steps taken. I think COVID did highlight the fact that our infrastructure, our technologies, the way that we've been doing things really did need a revamp. How a lot of companies didn't look at risk management. Now that's like a staple. How being adaptive to disruption, and how many disruptions are there nowadays, and how it's all interconnected. I don't really think that was highlighted until the pandemic, at least on a scale of business wide, global wide, that perspective. So,
Yeah. It was interesting to see how, the global supply chains as we knew it up until 2020 had been pretty stable, and it had taken
right,
decades to build that global supply chain, especially like in the US, so much of our supply chain got offshored and manufacturing got
right,
offshored, and it just became more of a complex global supply chain. And then when COVID hit, it sort of exposed the vulnerabilities and the risks.
right,
And so I don't know if, back to your point, I don't know if just in time and lean was the problem, or if it was the fact that we relied too much on, sole sourcing certain products to vendors that were in areas that were affected by, geopolitics or COVID or whatever. I don't know
right,
the answer to that, but it seems like it sort of exposed some of the vulnerabilities that were always there. It just, that supply chain was built for very stable times, it seems like.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And I would also say too that I don't feel like disruptions, I don't want to say they weren't as prevalent, because I think they were. I just
Yeah.
don't think we had the access to the information, the data, until COVID kind of highlighted that for us, of how many disruptions there are. I also don't think we really fully grasped how interconnected all of, the operations of supply chain are. It's not just one supply chain. It's both internal, external, on a macro scale. I really think the pandemic kind of highlighted the importance of understanding that interconnectivity among, every process within your organization, with your suppliers, with the suppliers of the suppliers, with your providers, with all of it, and just how lasting the impacts can be too.
Yeah.
Because it is a trickle down effect. I see it as kind of a systemic thing, right? Where you've got one risk that happens. Well, it's not isolated in most cases, especially on a scale of like the pandemic. It's
Yeah.
not isolated to one area of, supply chain or one company. It trickles down into everything else. And when you think about it in that more, I guess, systems type thinking, then you really start to understand, oh, that's why we're now more cognizant of the disruptions that are happening, and being able to see those a little more because we felt the impacts, as trickle down or as the direct receiver of the disruption. So it's been an interesting shift, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Now, a lot of what you're alluding to here is complexity and risk. Um,
Yes.
when you think back to all the different supply chains you work with and have worked with in the past, do you have one in particular that's the most complex, or maybe one example of a really complex supply chain? Maybe, you don't necessarily need to mention names or confidential information, but how do you give us a kind of a case study or a use case of one of the more complex ones you've seen?
Yeah. So I actually, oh gosh, I worked, and I feel like I'll preface this with, I feel like a lot of startup environments tend to be kind of like this, to be honest. So it's not uncommon to see this. But I worked with a company where they were manufacturing in China, and they were obviously pulling those products into the US, distributing them into retail locations within the US. But the products were, I guess, make to order, so customized.
Mm.
And so a lot of times they would face last minute changes. They would face last minute, oh, we need to alter the size. We need to alter this. We need to alter the color. We don't like that. And so being able to shift and pivot to those things alone within manufacturing was very complex. Because the other thing too is that putting the products into retail did not care if you did not hit a deadline. You had to hit that deadline. You're going into a retail outlet. There's no wiggle room on when they need the stuff at their location. And so you are still expected, despite the changes, to still get your product at that date. So it's a lot of pivoting, a lot of quick transitioning, and then adjusting all of your plans accordingly to fit that. And so I would say that was probably the most complex one that I have seen. But it did produce a lot of opportunity. And I think for a lot of startups within that side of things, it does produce a lot of opportunity to identify, hey, can we do things like mass customization? Can we get a baseline of things and then, customize at the last minute? Are we able to utilize, domestic distribution, or domestic being able to customize these products and then send them in? So that way you're cutting time out of your timeline, to be able to facilitate changes at the last minute. So it brought about an idea of how can we add buffer into different things? How do we add buffer into our manufacturing? How do we add buffer into our transportation? Because that's the other thing too. Getting container space, getting, air space, if you have to air freight, those are all different things, especially with fluctuating rates. Maybe you didn't plan for when you scoped, the project or scoped producing these products. So I would say that was probably the most complex one that I've had to deal with.
It sounds super complex. I mean, the make to order aspect of it, the make to order manufacturing combined with the global offshoring and that sort of thing. I can see how that could become very complex very quickly.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And putting out a lot of fires too, because, if you face a disruption at any point within that process and you've got a hard deadline, it's like you have to immediately jump in to fix it. And so, and like I said, I feel like that's pretty common within more startup realms, but it's looking at what are you currently doing? How can you at least mitigate a little bit of that disruption and plan ahead for some of those more things that are known to be happening? Like, for example, with one client, I always knew they were going to pop up at the last minute with a change. Okay, I then started to know I need to build a buffer here, or I need to come up with a different way of doing this more consistently, or I need to make sure that they're aware that if this change happens, we're going to have to add timeline, or we're going to have to add cost, or whatever the case may be. So you start to kind of learn some of those things that you can start to add into these executions, especially in the startup realm. But yeah, that was chaos all the time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it also begs the question of, do you ever find, like in that case study and or just clients you work with in general, that there's a conflict between, you talked about customer experience earlier, and
Right.
providing, in this example, the make to order manufacturer, providing what the customer wants as fast as they can get it. There's the customer experience side of it. There's the efficiency and profitability side of it, which
Right.
would suggest that you could stockpile inventory. That'd be another way to, you talked
Right.
about that earlier. You could just stockpile inventory, and that's a way to give yourself some buffer, but that's not profitable.
Right.
That's not the most profitable way to do it. And then you've got supply chain optimization, which, you're trying to sort of balance this all out. Do you find that there's like competing priorities that you've got to navigate, or how do you navigate it in that case of that example you just gave?
Yeah. So there's always competing priorities, I feel like. I mean, I don't, within supply chain, there's never a silver bullet, right?
Mhm.
Something is always going to take a hit if you want to do something else. It's all about how you balance that. So for example, and this is something I would face within that case study all the time of, yeah, we've got to extend manufacturing. Okay, well then I have to shorten transportation, which means increase the cost, because usually what, time is money, right? The faster the speed, the higher the cost. So then it would be, well, you can't do that. Okay, well then we can't shorten manufacture, or we can't extend manufacturing. What can we do instead? So there's always going to be competing priorities, I feel like. And it's not necessarily, I think it depends on the company of what their strategy and goals are, to know where you can, I don't want to say take a hit, but where you can take a hit on some things to achieve others. But I think companies who are looking at those competing priorities, it should never be a, hey, let's just say yes to everything and we'll figure
Yeah.
it out later, because that's how you get in those scenarios of where you're bleeding cost, you're producing a product that may not be up to standard. You're also not doing it in an efficient way to where it's going to be sustainable long term, especially if things do grow or if they do take off. So it has to be well thought out of, what can I sacrifice slightly to get more of what the customer wants, or a better, I guess, consumer experience. And there will always be a little bit of a trade-off. It is a balance.
Yeah, and I suppose it's back to what you said or alluded to around the prioritization. What are your priorities? I mean,
Right.
is it customer experience? Is it profitability and efficiency? What is your priority there?
Right.
Um, Want to say hello to Jason joining from the UK, Martin joining from Hayward, California. Thanks for being here today. Jason from the UK has a comment here, just building on what you said.
Mm.
Casey, Law of Bottleneck Management, Theory of Constraints reminds me of. I think I have the book in my office right here. The Goal. Do you ever read The Goal by Eli Goldratt? I think his name is.
No, but I've heard of it.
It's really good.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
old school, but it's really good.
I will say that these days, the most of my reading are like textbooks. I know how like weird that sounds, but like I love reading through textbooks. So
Right, right. Well, you're the first person I think I've had on the show that has said that they love reading textbooks. But
it's
if you ever
weird.
want to change a pace, you might like this one, The Goal, because it's a story. It's a fable, but it's building on academic concepts, but it's
Okay.
telling it in more of a story format. So if you
Okay.
need like a lighter version of learning, the Goal by
Yeah.
Eli Goldratt's a really good one.
Okay.
Um, and so, one question, follow-up question that sort of builds on the question I just asked you about the most complex supply chain. Darian on LinkedIn asked, "What's the most effective supply chain you've seen?" Do you have an example of one that was just either before and or after you were involved and you helped them get to this future state? What were some of the traits of that most effective supply chain that you've seen?
So actually, I'm going to approach this from a consumer's perspective,
Okay.
because most of the companies I work with, there's a lot of issues within their operation. So while we can make a small improvement and it gets better, there tends to be more improvements that have to be made, and I think that comes from my continuous improvement mindset. I never see, a supply chain process as like this is like the top tier gold standard. However, that's because I'm in the weeds, right? I'm supposed to be looking at it from a business perspective of where can we do things better. As a consumer, though, and I think it's important for us as business people to look at things from the consumer's perspective. As a consumer, let's just take a look at, Amazon, Walmart, and how we experience those supply chains. I mean, I think, for me, I hop on Amazon. And of course, I'm not the average consumer. I know a lot about supply chain. So of course I'm looking for these things. But, I hop on there and I'm going, okay, I can buy a product. It can be in my hands sometimes in the same day. Think about the efficiency of how that product has to move to be able to be in my hands if I order at 10 a.m. Eastern today and it be here by 7, 8 o'clock tonight. Right?
Yeah.
It's incredible to stop and think the flow of data, the visibility within their systems, the visibility within their distribution facilities, their warehouses, the level of inventory management they have to maintain. Walmart's another one who's been working on their supply chain to get it to the level to compete with Amazon, and how they've shifted from brick and mortar to more e-commerce style. And when you look at it from that perspective of like a consumer, I see those things as like, wow, that's incredible, right? Of course, if I got into the business side of it, I'd probably be like, y'all have got gaps all over the place. But but looking at it from the consumer side, and I think it's important to do that sometimes, and not look at it from that business perspective, but think of it as consumers ourselves. You really do see the magnitude of how when products move and they can move that quickly, they can move that easily and be at your doorstep. It is pretty incredible to actually sit and think about. So
yeah, all the things that need to go right and be well
right.
orchestrated to make that happen. And it's interesting too, because a lot of times when you think about supply chains are so complex that it's easy to turn inward and like, let's just focus on ourselves and all the stuff we need to do and all these moving parts we need to manage. But you keep coming back to this point of looking at it from the customer experience. You've mentioned it a few times now, customer experience, look at it from the customer angle. And I think if you do that, that sort of gives you, it shines a light on the things that are most important, getting back to that prioritization piece of it.
Yep.
Very interesting. Here's a question. I'm nervous to ask you this question. I'll tell you, let me preface it by saying I just filmed a batch of YouTube videos yesterday and I covered this exact topic. And I just know already, I'm going to ask you this question. You're going to say something that's going to be like, I should have covered that in the video, but it's too late because I already filmed it. So you're going to make my next YouTube video obsolete before it even comes out, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And this is great because this is from John Belden, who is actually a guest on the show. He's been on the show a couple times. He's from Upper Edge. I'll give Upper Edge a free plug here. They're a software, or they consult to companies. They're doing software negotiations, among other things. But John from Upper Edge says, I'd love to know if there have been any visible impacts of Gen AI, where visible impacts were probable impacts and where it has been tested and perhaps not paid dividends. So just in general, are you seeing generative AI affect supply chain management? How's it affecting you and your client base?
Yes. So, it's so interesting. And this is something that I think technology as a whole, it kind of needs to be addressed. I've seen a lot of talks, and I'm not very involved with the whole, how do I say, like, back end side of the AI type technology. Like I can understand from the surface of like what it's supposed to do, how it fits into a process, what it's supposed to be able to predict within a process,
how you use it,
how to use it. But from like the back end side, like the computer side, no, that's going way over my head. So, but I will say with technology in general, we cannot lose sight of the fact that it is a tool, right? We can't lose sight of the fact that you have to have your operations and your processes kind of set and in place and know what's going on in your organization to be able to leverage tools like that can truly add enhancement and make a positive impact. But if it's not leveraged the right way, then it's not going to pay the dividends. Because you have to kind of think of that in terms of a garbage in, garbage out, right? Like this goes back to the lean methodology mentality. Value and waste. If you've got waste flowing within your processes, if you've got erratic flows, if you've got problem areas or gaps or inefficiencies or things that aren't working as they should, if you just slap technology over that, expecting that it's going to produce a usable result, I wouldn't necessarily trust that, because if you put garbage in, you're probably going to get garbage out. And, and I think of it from, I'm very avid in fitness. And so for me, I can't be sitting here eating ice cream well, I would if I could. I can't be eating ice cream every day and then going into the gym and expecting that that's going to fuel me in the right way to get a desired output, right? The same concept can kind of be applied here. You can't have inputs in a process or bad data filling that process and expecting that technology or AI can take it and do something with it that's going to be effective. And in my experience, I mean, I can say that from even using AI myself. I think we all have used, Chat GPT to like help us brainstorm or whatever the case is. And I know if I plug in a prompt that isn't what I'm looking for, what is it going to do? It's going to produce an output, but it's probably not going to be the output I'm looking for. The same concept can apply within your supply chain processes as well. So I think with that, with that question, there are visible impacts of if you've got your processes in order and you know what's going on within your organization and you've leveraged the tool to support automating or using it in a manner that's going to actually benefit and take you in a forward progression to where you want to be, then sure, right? Obviously, you may have to make some small tweaks, but if you've not done that initial step of baselining and you're just going to slap technology over it, I don't think it's going to produce the dividends that you would hope it would. So
yeah. Where do you think, like, if you had to predict then, where do you think generative AI could add the most value? Assuming you've got a customer or client that has their ducks in a row as far as the processes are well defined, you've got good data, all that stuff. Are there certain like areas of low hanging fruit that you think could be ripe for generative AI?
Yes. I mean, I would say route optimization within transportation is one. And that's on a global scale too, being able to understand, hey, if we've got disruption, and this feeds into risk management, right? If we've got disruption here, how can we optimize the route to still get our product on time and at the lowest cost? And that's globally, domestically, maybe moving it in via like LTL versus truckload, things like that, splitting the shipments, whatever it is. I think it could be very useful within that. But from a general risk management perspective, of course, I look at everything from the project management, risk management perspective, right? I'm looking at it as, okay, everything is a risk. Everything is a disruption. Right. So, like not only within transportation, but also like inventory management, right? How do we better forecast? How do we narrow down that forecast to where we're not holding too much inventory, which becomes a risk, but we're also not getting where we have stock outs, which is a risk in itself as well. So definitely within inventory management, definitely within the transportation side, I can see that type of technology being utilized very, very effectively. But then also in terms of like automating some of these back end tasks and accuracy within a lot of processes, I think is key throughout supply chain. So
yeah. Even some of the little mundane things that are required to manage a supply chain. You think about something like setting up a vendor master.
Yes.
The time it takes to do that, could you use generative AI to do something like that, or creating an inventory record or like an item master, that sort of thing. So just some of the things that you've got to do to set up and get that data in place that you're talking about, you could be using generative AI to help create some of that data more consistently, more efficiently too.
Yeah.
What about, here's a really interesting question that I hadn't thought of covering this topic, but I think it's interesting. This question is from Srinath on YouTube. Srinath asks, hi, I'd love to know what sort of visualization tools do industry professionals use to map out the operations process in business? So do you have certain visualization tools you use when you're mapping out a supply chain or the supply chain processes?
Yes. So I use Visio, but I know some people use Lucidchart. There's so many options out there. I know for me, I like Visio. It's just an easy way to be able to draw my maps and quickly do them. But there's other ways as well. You can just manually draw them. And so there's some technologies now where you can write on the screen and it produces it for you. But those are the two biggest ones that I would say that I've worked with and I like using.
Yeah. Great. Here's another interesting one. It sort of builds on what you were talking about just a few minutes ago. This is from Sarandri on YouTube. Sarandri says, hi, how can I build resilience in my international business supply chain? how to best reconfigure supply chains against disruption management. You did talk about this a little bit before, but I want to come back to it because I think it is a fascinating topic, and this is a great follow-up question here. But what are some of the ways or strategies that you've seen organizations build that resilience, that flexibility? How are you seeing them reconfigure their supply chains to deal with this risk and disruption that you've been talking about throughout this conversation?
Yeah. So I would say the first thing with building resilience, and I keep going back to this because I see things from a very process perspective. I see a business as a system. I see a supply chain as a system. And I think it's important to look at it from that perspective. So I'd say the first thing is understand that businesses and supply chains are a system, right? You've got one thing that happens, it's going to impact the output. So when you think of resilience, when you think of it on the scale of, end-to-end systems thinking, you start to then expect disruption. And I think that's the other thing that, we often are very reactionary to disruption, instead shifting the mindset. So some of it's just a mindset shift. And then when you start to look at it from, okay, how do I proactively identify where disruptions occur or where the risks are? It's then looking at within your procurement. Have you vetted your suppliers? Have you gone through with them to make sure their quality is up to standard? Within your manufacturing, are they producing products at the top tier, most efficient level? What type of equipment are they using? What type of machines are they using? Are they maintaining quality there? When you get into logistics, then you start to go, well, wait a second. Is that carrier able to service all of my lanes? Are they able to actually move that product for me? Do they have the capacity to be able to move this even in peak seasons? You start to look at your warehousing. Do they have the capacity to hold my products? What are the costs that they're holding them for? Are there areas to, cut those costs out, or maybe optimize that through leveraging a different type of partner? And you kind of start to think, once you shift your mindset into going, okay, where can I identify problems? How can I expect disruption? You start to then piece together very quickly, oh, here's the areas I need to start thinking of. And when you start at those small areas, then you start to build that resilience a little better. The other side of it is being able to be agile too. And I think there's a balance between trying to be planned and trying to be agile and trying to adapt. But again, if you take that mindset shift and seeing it as a system, looking at it from an end-to-end perspective, and then proactively trying to say, where can things go wrong? You start to then build that resilience and start to spot and combat those disruptions or risks.
Yeah, and back to your earlier thread and points up around the customer experience, if you can look at it from maybe pull out some use cases, like if most of us working in supply chain management have some sort of breakdowns or failures in our supply chain. So let's take that as a use case and figure out, how did that break?
Right.
What happened there? How did it affect the customer? What should have happened? And what could have happened if we could do it differently? And you sort of use that failure point as an opportunity to learn and say, okay, well, let's figure out how to provide a better customer experience with the supply chain.
Right.
Yeah. What emerging trends, we started to talk about this a little bit earlier, but what emerging trends or technologies are you most excited about, or do you think are the most promising in this world of supply chain management?
Yeah. So, it's so funny to me because I've heard a lot of talks, especially within the transportation side, of visibility, right? Everyone wants to know where the products are at. And I think within transportation alone, if companies were able to actually leverage that visibility in a way that's going to be effective for the shipper, I think it could be useful. But I think a lot of companies are now starting to understand the concept of visibility from an end-to-end perspective and how that data can flow. So I'd say one of the more promising things is the interconnectivity of systems and how companies are trying to create that visibility from end to end. I mean, I'm talking consumer data all the way back to your manufacturer, and figuring out how can we make sure that there's a real-time visibility for all parties involved within the supply chain. So that's one. The other thing, obviously, AI, robotics. I mean, I've seen some cool stuff with how, robots are operating within, some of these DCs and facilities with picking and packing. And it's really incredible to see. But I go back to that point of, you have to make sure that you've got your, I won't say your house in order, but you got to make sure your processes are in order before leveraging those technologies. And I'll give an example. I worked with a company where they wanted to implement robots into their DC, and they had 27 systems talking behind the scenes to
Oh,
each other, flowing data. And I'm sitting there going, what? But you want to leverage a robot? Why haven't we thought about fixing that other problem first?
and then
So
get to the robots later.
right,
Yeah.
right. So it's one of those things where it's like, yes, everyone wants to be able to leverage and use this new technology and the cool way of doing things, but it's also being cognizant of the fact that you have to take incremental steps. And that's okay, because any forward progress is still forward progress. So
Yeah. Yeah. Great points. And yeah, I agree with that. I think there's there's we're at this point, this interesting point in technology and just the way things are changing, where there's all this cool stuff out in the distance and stuff that's available right now. I mean, you
right,
can get any of this cool stuff like robotics and AI, all the stuff we've been talking about. You can get this stuff right now. But
right,
so many of us and so many organizations here listening are stuck further back. We're
right,
still trying to figure out how to tie together 27 systems, or we're still trying to figure out how to clean up our data. We're still trying to figure out how to
right,
stop using spreadsheets. So you think about things like that, and it can be overwhelming to say, well, how am I going to use generative AI if I'm still using
right.
spreadsheets over here? Well, okay, generative AI is still going to be there. It's going to keep changing. Let's get some incremental steps and
Yes,
wins now, and sort of clean up some of this stuff behind the scenes. And then you can start thinking about robotics and AI and
right.
whatever other trend that comes around that we don't even know about yet.
Well, and that's the thing too, is there's always something new and innovative coming out as well. And so, that's why I always challenge my clients and customers to make sure that when they invest in this type of technology, or, the things that they're looking at doing, that it comes from a more long range perspective, right? Because this stuff is evolving very quickly. And when you invest that amount of time, the amount of resources, and the money into implementing these new systems or tools, you want to make sure that they are going to be able to be scalable. They're going to be able to last for the long haul and be able to evolve, and then also integrate with some of those new ways of doing things as well when they come about. So it's something where, I try to challenge, especially small businesses. You can't be looking and comparing yourselves to the multi-billion
Yeah.
dollar organizations who can try out various technologies. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, they can adjust it, right? They've got the money to be able to do some of those things. Smaller companies do not. And so you want to make sure that you're comparing yourself with yourself, the level that you're at, and what's industry standard for where you're at, and making sure that what you're investing into is going to be valuable for you for now, but also for the long term as well. You want to make sure you get that return on the investment.
Yeah, for sure. And, there's some technology that might be too high cost, too high risk without enough of a
Yes.
justifiable ROI right now. And that's okay. You don't, just because everyone else
Yep.
is using Gen AI or whatever the tool is, doesn't mean you
Right.
need to. I mean, you might have bigger fish to fry, or, lower hanging fruit to try and address
Right.
first. And you got to define a strategy that fits that, I suppose.
Right.
What about, what about careers? Let's talk about careers for a second. Anytime I talk about supply chain management or put a video out about supply chain management, I get a ton of questions around careers. Like I want to pivot into supply chain management,
Mm.
or I'm a supply chain manager. I'd like to get into supply chain consulting or something, like, just a lot of questions around careers. But what sort of advice would you give to people that are either aspiring professionals in the supply chain space, or they're just trying to further their careers in the space? What sort of general advice would you have?
Yeah. So, it's interesting because I wish I had someone when I was early on in my career kind of guiding me, and now I see the value of asking these types of questions and having people contribute this type of knowledge, because I wish I would have known some of this stuff. So I will say that before we go into this.
Right.
But one of the things is always be learning. Whether that's like truly invest in yourself to learn and to know these things and to gather tools and knowledges that are going to set you apart in the industry. And I don't mean go get, all these degrees like I have. That's just a me thing. I like learning in that way. But, learn from networking and other industry professionals, learn from going to industry events, learn from workshops or podcasts like this, learn from seminars, special events, short courses. there's so many certifications you can get now that weren't available, 10 years ago, related to technology, related to different models and frameworks within supply chain, and going to attack those things just to kind of help give you another set of skills and tools that you can leverage within your role. But then I would also say challenge yourself to get as much experience within the industry from an end-to-end perspective. And I don't mean job hop. That's not what I'm saying. But, try to get experience in procurement, in distribution, in manufacturing, in logistics, and get that end-to-end perspective. Because one of the biggest things that I've seen within organizations is there is lacking that knowledge of end-to-end and how it all fits together. And so going to try to understand it from that perspective is going to give you a leg up within a lot of these organizations, because you start to think of things on a more holistic scale than if it's just within a functional area. You're starting to broaden those siloed barriers, I guess, and making it more organizational wide, not just department wide. So that would be the biggest thing. Networking, that's always a good one. It's always great to meet other professionals in the industry, but always be learning and try to just expand your knowledge and scope as much as you can.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, you talk about silos and, you want to think end to end. I think you're sort of striking at the heart of what's wrong with a lot of supply chains, or where the inefficiencies, breakdowns are. It's because we're operating in silos. The customer service group isn't linking up or isn't integrated with the logistics group, but, we're all kind of operating our own little silos and optimizing our little silos, but it's hard for a lot of people to think about, well, how does this all tie together? How's it all optimize across there? I'll throw out one other shameless plug, since we're talking about education. And actually, Casey, I am going to invite you to this to speak at it. So not to put you on the spot, but I am going to extend an invitation for you to speak at this event. But this is an event called Digital Stratosphere we do every year. It's going to be in October in Denver, downtown Denver, Colorado. We do tons of different speakers and sessions on digital transformation. We're going to cover supply chain management. We cover process improvement, change management, all that sort of stuff. We're doing your early bird pricing. I put a QR code up on the screen. If you're watching this on the video version, just scan the QR code. I'll leave it up here for a few minutes. You can learn more about the event, see the agenda, how it's shaping up. You can also see the pricing options and whatnot. But there's an early bird discount. You get 20% off. If you want to attend, I'll be there. Hopefully Casey will be there. I haven't asked her yet, but we'll see if she's going to be there. And then, I don't know what I'm doing that day, but sure. But and there's so far we've got about a dozen speakers lined up, but we'll have a couple dozen by the time all is said and done. A lot of different topics, a lot of diverse opinions. So scan the QR code if you want to learn more about it and see kind of the agendas from last year and whatnot. But I'll leave that out for a second. So that's another educational opportunity. And hopefully that helps, that Casey's feedback there gives you some advice on how to navigate your career, because I know a lot of people are really interested in this field. Mm-hmm. What do you think? What do you think the prospects are for careers in supply chain management? Do you see it as a growing space? Is there going to be more demand for people that know the stuff? Are there certain skills that are going to be in more demand? What are your thoughts?
Yes. So, it's funny you asked that. So I've been doing a lot of work within the education space, working with some universities. And one of the things that, everyone is trying to figure out are what are the skills needed in supply chain as it's changing so rapidly. I'd say as of right now, analytics, technology, those are key things that a lot of schools are teaching and trying to provide as skills for students, coming out of, their programs and getting into the workforce. But I would also say I go back to understanding that end-to-end and systems thinking. That's another key skill. The other thing is, I don't want to say, I would say cross-disciplinary. I don't want to say like one discipline's better than the other, but really understanding and integrating, like project management and supply chain, or understanding how agile within project management can fit into supply chain. I know I'm also working on my PMP, so getting some of those certifications more on the project management side. Those are very valuable skills right now because, like I said before at the start of this, a lot of companies are executing initiatives. So between like the tech and the data side of the skill set, but also the project management side, which comes with that leadership component and, how to get a team together and that team building component. So I think those are all important skills as supply chain continues to evolve.
Yeah. So just to sort of continue thinking in the future here, are there certain projects or initiatives that you're working on that you're particularly excited about that you're able to share with the audience here today?
So actually, yes, there is one that I'm doing some advisory work on, tech company, and it's a visibility tool. It's fantastic, and to be able to add true end-to-end visibility, it's going to be really cool. I can't really share too much about it, but it's going to be really cool. The other thing that I've been working on, like I said, I've been working with universities. I'm doing some course development with helping getting programs up and going at schools. But then also I'm going to be doing some guest short courses with a university. I don't think I'm allowed to announce who it is yet. I'll let them do the honors later. But short courses starting in August with the university within, supply chain, logistics, transportation. And I'm super excited about that. I'm passionate about the educational side and being able to teach and educate. And so I'm excited about those two projects.
Oh, cool. And you should add Stratosphere to as a third, because if you like to teach, you'll love coming to Stratosphere too. You're the first person I put on the spot and said I'm going to invite you to the conference live in front of an audience. So
that's awesome.
Thanks for being a sport about that. And actually, I've got a couple bonus questions. I was sort of winding down, but I have to come back to this question because it's a really good one.
Okay.
And this is from Twitch. Actually, we don't get a lot of questions from Twitch, but the question here is from the handle name Ringer. How do emerging technologies like AI, Internet of Things, and blockchain contribute to enhancing predictive analytics and operational efficiency in modern supply chain management? That's a big question, but what are your thoughts there?
I would say from a general perspective, the emerging technologies are providing the data and the framework to be able to then predict from it, if that makes sense, at least in my experience. I think it's important, though, that we realize how these technologies work together. It does rely on a quality data set and where that data is coming from. But I would say that's they set the framework for then how to predict and iterate and be able to learn from that. So,
yeah, very cool. So, closing advice for a team member or an organization that's sort of taken all this information in, learned a lot of stuff, hopefully, from you. Now, what do I do? How do I get started? Like, what are some first steps or next steps that you typically see that works, regardless of where you are in your maturity of your supply chain and what your specific problems are? Like, what are some tangible next steps to get started?
Yeah, I would say if you know what your problems are, root cause analysis, make sure that you really know what your problems are, because sometimes what is perceived as a problem is actually a surface level manifestation of something deeper. So make sure that you're doing root cause analysis on what your perceived problems are. And then from there, you're able to identify, oh, that's an issue. How do we solve it? Right. If you don't really know what your problems are, a good first step is mapping out your processes in your supply chain. You'll identify pretty quickly where there's some gaps and what your problems could be. Or it's, collaborating with other folks within the industry to pick their brains. You can pull in an outside resource to help with that. But I would say for the most part, a lot of companies have the capabilities themselves before having to go that route to really see, hey, if we just map out this process or document this down or look at it from what's happening in it, we're going to see pretty quick, wait a second, that doesn't line up, right? And those are easy ways that you can actually get started with process improvement or identifying where you might have some problem areas.
Yeah, that's a great starting point, regardless of where you are in the journey and where specific pain points are. If you start there, I mean, that usually opens up sort of some clarity on where you go from there. How do people learn more about you? How do we connect with you? How do we follow you? How do we learn more?
Yes. So you can find me on LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest way. I'm usually pretty active on there. And you can reach out to me that way or via my website, which is 828consultingllc.com. And there's a contact me form through there as well. Either way, though, probably LinkedIn's the fastest and easiest. Everyone's on LinkedIn. So
Yeah, exactly. And just so people know that how to spell your name, it's first name Casey, C-A-C or C-A-S-E-Y. Jenkins
Yep.
is Jenkins. So if you're watching on another platform right now and you switch over to LinkedIn, you can go search Casey Jenkins there to find her there, or 828 Consulting. Well, great. Thanks for being here today, Casey. This is really, really cool, very enlightening. We could have spent hours longer talking about this stuff, but we'll leave it at that for this first time, and love to have you back at some point on the podcast.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right. And thank you to the audience for the great questions. Again, this live discussion will get edited. Not that it needs much editing with how great you were, Casey, but we'll edit it. We'll polish it up. We'll add some more content to it, and we'll release it as another episode of Transformation Ground Control, which you can find at transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also find it on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, all the usual suspects when it comes to audio podcast platforms, as well as streaming to YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So thanks for being here today, everyone. Look forward to chatting again next week. Hope you have a great week in the meantime.